Hey sir, this is my first deployment to Iraq. Where am I supposed to throw out my trash? That's easy, Cappy, just toss it in the burn pit over there. Are you talking about that 6-foot deep hole in the ground over there that's on fire 24/7 from burning jet fuel that's about 100 feet away from where we eat and sleep every night? Yeah, poke it with a stick, it'll help it burn faster. No, sir, I have batteries and toxic chemicals in here. Are you sure it's a good idea for me to burn this? Is breathing in those fumes really gonna be good for our health, sir? I love the smell of burn pits in the morning. The Department of Defense estimated that 3.5 million service members were exposed to toxic burn pits during the war on terror. Exposure to hazardous fumes from these burn pits has already been linked to respiratory, cardiovascular disease, and possibly rare forms of cancer. So the military disposed of paint, batteries, medical waste, rubber tires, electronics, weapons, unexploded ordnance, human waste, and amputated body parts, all tossed into burn pits. I slept about 100 feet away from a burn pit on a small remote combat outpost that I lived on just north of Baghdad. It took months after I got home to get that smell of burning metal and chemicals out of my nose, and it took even longer for me to snap out of the habit of tossing my trash onto a fire. Apparently that's not okay to do anywhere outside of Iraq, but it's not like we had another good option. Delivering it off base to a landfill would have been dangerous.
And dumping at an unsecured landfill gives the enemy an opportunity to loot top secret information and old uniforms to sneak on base with.
Which brings up a much bigger question that the Army's been struggling with since its inception, which is what's the correct way to dispose of garbage in a combat zone? In order to understand that, we're gonna need to investigate the ugly truth about how waste management works in combat zones. Part of the reason for burn pits is because US forces were stretched incredibly thin at the height of the Iraq War, when there was 175,000 troops stationed at over 500 bases across the country. The Army made up for their lack of manpower by hiring private contractors to fill many non-combat roles like trash management. Kellogg Brown and Root, or KBR, was the private civilian company that the military hired to operate the larger burn pits. They were given a $35 billion logistics contract, giving them an incentive to continue using dangerous burn pits instead of using safer alternatives like trash incinerators.
By continuing to use these burn pits and claiming that these sites are expeditionary, KBR is able to drag out the life of the LOGCAP III contract and continue to get taxpayer dollars.
KBR was claiming they were expeditionary still, so the Army wouldn't find a long-term solution to the burn pits that wasn't in their contract. That's because according to Army regulations, burn pits are supposed to be a last resort.
The Army Field Manual recommends 3 possible solutions for safely disposing of waste during war, including burning, burial, or backhauling. Burial wouldn't work on a big fob or even on a small combat outpost because it would quickly fill up the entire base and the trash would cause disease and illness. These regulations were born out of a history of improper waste disposal where they would just bury their trash right next to where they were living, and it caused more casualties on the battlefield than the enemy. The other option, backhauling, means logistics trucks would drive out to these small outposts and pick up trash and then deliver it back to the major fobs, where incinerators could be located. But this presents its own set of new tactical problems. Convoys of troops picking up trash would have to risk their lives to pick up and drop off the waste from these small combat outposts to major fobs located 10 miles away. It would have increased the load on logistics operations and left these truck drivers wide open to an increased number of additional ambushes and IED attacks. In June 2007, there were 3,671 attacks on coalition forces, with the insurgents' favorite target being these kinds of logistics supply convoys that would carry trash. 60% of American fatalities in Iraq and 50% of Afghanistan fatalities were caused by IEDs, many of them targeting these kinds of convoys. I'm not sure I would have been happy to know that I would let other soldiers risk their lives to pick up trash from our tiny outpost. DoD reports showed that large bases in Iraq and Afghanistan produced around 80,000 pounds of solid waste per day, which was then tossed into burn pits and lit on fire using JP-8 jet fuel. The reason the more toxic JP-8 jet fuel was used to fuel the burn pits is because that's the fuel developed by the military in the 1990s to have a higher flash point. So what does that mean? Regular gasoline ignites and explodes at around -50 degrees Fahrenheit, making it incredibly flammable.
JP-8 was developed to be much safer with a flash point of over 100 degrees, so it's much more difficult to light on fire and accidentally explode your entire ammunition stockpile.
But this safety comes at the cost of being more toxic. Personnel who were frequently around JP-8 and self-reported that they had difficulty breathing, weaknesses, trouble concentrating, and trouble gripping objects. Right at the beginning of the the Afghanistan war in 2001, burn pits were used partly because the nation there had no existing landfill infrastructure of its own.
Citizens were burning trash in the streets or dumping it into their city's river.
Iraq also has no reliable waste management infrastructure.
According to this paper written by Ashif al-Najjar,
Iraq produced an estimated 31,000 tons of solid waste every day. The Iraqi people would dispose of all of their trash in unregulated landfills across the country that ended up seeping deep into the groundwater and contaminated it. People didn't even have safe drinking water because of this. The largest base in Iraq, called Joint Base Balad, operated a burn pit that covered a whole entire 10 acres of land, and the resulting smoke would pass over the whole base, being breathed in by 25,000 service members stationed there. This study found they burned 200 tons of waste there every day in 2007. It was a free-for-all, military-themed version of Burning Man between 2002 and 2009, when there were zero regulations as to what kind of hazardous materials could be thrown into these pits.
So it probably took us a long time to realize that this was a problem, right?
Complaints started right at the beginning of the war in 2004 at Dr. Robert Miller's pulmonology clinic, when soldiers were coming to him saying that they could barely walk up a flight of stairs without gasping for air. Miller ordered lung biopsies and found evidence of toxic lung injury. He contacted doctors at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, who were cooperative at first, but by 2009, the Department of Defense completely cut ties with Dr. Miller, probably because once they realized the implications of the work he was doing, the government was potentially going to be stuck with billions of dollars worth of medical bills for these sick veterans if they were going to be held accountable. It's taken over a decade of fighting for multiple acts of Congress to even begin to address this complicated issue. Meanwhile, it wasn't until 2009 that the first congressional action against burn pits was taken,
which prohibited the military from disposing of toxic waste in burn pits.
Great, end of the story. The problem's been solved and we all lived in a trash-free, peaceful world.
Except it only got worse from there.
In 2010, the DoD still reported to Congress that open-air burning was still the safest, most effective solid waste reduction compared to any available alternative. But was that really true, or is it just the cheapest option available? The commander of my unit in Iraq, for example, he tried hiring local civilian Iraqis to come and pick up the waste instead of burning it all, but we had to stop doing that when we found out that these locals were spying and giving information about the location of our vehicles and the numbers of troop movements in and out of our base and where we had our living quarters stationed. So they were giving all of that to the enemy. So you could see where there are security concerns. The only other viable alternative would have been a garbage incinerator, which uses a filter to safely destroy waste. The only downside is it's the most expensive way to handle waste, and it requires qualified people who are trained and know how to operate and maintain it.
3 incinerators are going to basically eliminate that problem.
He's right, they should have solved the problem. However, in 2013, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan did an investigation looking for corruption and found the following.
Fob Salerno's base commander chose not to budget for maintenance of base's new incinerators, even though they had just spent $5 million to construct these incinerators. So the incinerators were literally never used for disposal until the day the base was shut down in 2013. Now, I don't know for certain if this is because the commander spent the money saved on waste management instead on weapons and equipment to protect soldiers' lives, or if he did it to get an extra shiny medal for keeping costs low that year. But it doesn't look good, right? It wasn't until 2009, 2 years before the end of the Iraq War, when the US Central Command issued what was called Regulation 200-2. This is important. This regulation states that when bases exceed 100 US personnel for 90 days, then the commander must create a plan for installing an alternative waste disposal technology, like an incinerator. Except burn pit operations continued after 2009 because base commanders in Iraq and Afghanistan continued to neglect to pay contracts to keep incinerators operational.
This is because there was pressure to keep costs low.
In one instance, a 40-ton capacity incinerator installed in Afghanistan could only process 80% of the base's needs. This was due to poor planning. The location of this incinerator was installed, it was too narrow for forklifts to load waste into it, so it had to be done by hand. By 2010, the DoD had installed 39 waste incinerators in Iraq and 20 in Afghanistan, but very few of them were actually operational. So KBR, the private company, continued to collect money to operate these open-air burn pits.
The DoD, of course, had an excuse for this.
Now, the fact that base sizes were in constant flux during wartime meant the lack of predictability made base planning and investment of resources difficult for waste management. And this is true. When I was in Iraq, some bases were downsized or completely abandoned while others were increased in size. These kind of troop movements make it difficult to know if you should set up waste managements that are going to cost millions of dollars if they're going to be completely gone in 12 months. So by me outlining the thought process behind why burn pits were really used and some of the major problems with their alternatives, I'm not trying to make excuses for the Department of Defense. What they did was awful and inexcusable, and it hurt soldiers. But we need to understand how serious this problem is so we can come up with better technology and better solutions that are cheaper and easier to use on small bases. So, what can be done to hold the government accountable for putting their soldiers at risk like this?
And has there been any lasting, meaningful change here?
In 2013, President Obama signed the National Burn Pit Registry into law, and in 2018, President Trump signed Helping Vets Exposed to Burn Pits Act. But all of this legislation had not provided the necessary funds to care for the healthcare cost of the victims. That's when in 2022, another act was proposed called the PACT Act, which would further extend veterans' healthcare benefits, expanding coverage by an estimated $278 billion. This created a lot of controversy. US senators debated whether or not the money in this bill was set aside for veterans who were victims of toxic burn pits, or if it could be used for other non-related purposes and balloon up to $66 billion. The bill passed and was signed into law on August 10, 2022 by President Biden.
But with no better alternative, burn pits remain in use in some cases. As of today, even though the Pentagon acknowledges the risks of these burn pits, there are still about 8 major ones that are in operation, 7 in Syria and 1 in Egypt. The DoD claims there's no better alternative, and there are valid questions about whether the VA will approve any of those claims.
To me, the way I look at it is this is actually one of those rare instances where in the end, things are slightly better than they were when they began. There are now regulations controlling how hazardous waste can be disposed of in combat zones, and that's going to limit the health risks. And the soldiers who have suffered health consequences because of burn pits are now at least getting the medical care that they need.